Every civilization that has ever existed believed it would last. The Romans believed it. The Greeks believed it. The great empires of the ancient world were not built by people who thought they were building something temporary. They were built by people who thought they were building something eternal. And then they were gone. Not slowly, not gracefully. Gone. The Franks, a Germanic warband from the forested edges of the old Roman world, looked at the wreckage of the greatest empire the West had ever known, and they did not wait for someone else to fill the silence. They filled it themselves. And what they built did not last a century or two before collapsing like every other kingdom that rose from Rome's ashes. What they built is still here, the map of modern Europe, the authority of the Catholic Church, and the political idea that a ruler's power must be sanctioned by something higher than force, the borders between France and Germany. None of these things emerged naturally or inevitably from the ruins of Rome. They were engineered, deliberately, violently, and with extraordinary institutional intelligence by a dynasty of Frankish kings across 3 centuries. This is the story of how they did it and what it actually cost. In the year 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, sent the imperial insignia east to Constantinople, and declared that there would be no more emperors in the West. It was not a dramatic moment. No city burned that day. No army was broken in the field. The Western Roman Empire did not end with a catastrophe. It ended with a formality, not a piece of administrative paperwork acknowledging what everyone already knew. The real empire had been dissolving for decades, quietly and irreversibly, from the inside out. What Rome had built at its height was not just a military system. It was a machine for extracting taxes, maintaining roads, moving grain, enforcing contracts, training administrators, staffing courts, and projecting written law across a territory that stretched from the Scottish lowlands to the edge of the Sahara. That machine required fuel, a constant flow of revenue, labor, and institutional attention. And by the late 4th century, the fuel was running out. The tax base was shrinking, the currency was debased, the frontier was longer than the army could cover. When the machine stopped, everything that depended on it stopped too. Roads were not repaired because there was no central authority to fund the work and no mechanism to compel it. Long-distance trade contracted because the roads were dangerous and the courts that had once enforced commercial contracts no longer reliably existed. The merchants who had once moved grain, wine, oil, and finished goods across the Mediterranean retreated to local markets and barter. The complex, interconnected economy of the Roman world compressed itself into something smaller, more local, and considerably poorer. The city of Rome itself was the starkest measure of the collapse. At the height of the empire, roughly 1 million people had lived within its walls, sustained by grain shipped from North Africa, water piped from the hills by aqueducts maintained at imperial expense, and bread distributed by a state that understood urban population as a political fact requiring management. By the early Middle Ages, that population had fallen to perhaps 20,000. The aqueducts still stood. The forums still stood. But the city they had served was gone, and the great stone structures had become quarries and pasture land. The administrative apparatus went with the population. The men who had staffed the imperial bureaucracy, who could read, write contracts, adjudicate disputes, calculate taxes, and correspond in the formal Latin of Roman governance, had no institution left to employ them. Literacy retreated. The cursus honorum, the structured career path that had trained Roman administrators for generations, ceased to function when the positions it led to ceased to exist. Within a generation of the collapse, illiteracy was becoming rare even among the ruling classes of the successor kingdoms. The knowledge required to run a complex state was not written down in any accessible form. It had lived in the habits, training, and institutional memory of the people who were now gone. Into this space came the Germanic peoples, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Lombards, and others, each establishing kingdoms over territories that had been Roman provinces. They were not invaders in the simple sense. Many of them had served in Roman armies, adopted Roman dress, spoken Latin in formal contexts, and spent decades inside the empire's borders before its political authority collapsed. They knew the Roman world intimately. What they did not know, what no one in the 5th century knew, was how to replicate it. The problem was structural. Roman authority had not rested on the personal qualities of individual emperors, most of whom were unremarkable or worse. It had rested on institutions, on the Senate, the army, the law courts, the tax system, the bureaucracy, each of which reinforced the others and gave the whole apparatus a stability that no single ruler could provide or undermine on his own. The Germanic kingdoms had no equivalent institutions. Their authority was personal. A Germanic king ruled because he could lead men in battle, reward followers with land and treasure, and command the loyalty of warriors who had bound themselves to him directly. That authority lasted exactly as long as the king's ability to keep performing those functions. Succession was the first and most persistent crisis. The Roman emperors had managed succession badly enough. The 3rd century alone produced dozens of claimants and counterclaimants. But they had at least possessed an institutional framework within which succession disputes could be contained. The Germanic tradition was different. Kingship passed within a dynasty, but no rule determined which son, which branch, or which collateral heir held the rightful claim. Every succession was a negotiation conducted under the constant threat of armed resolution. A kingdom that had held together under a strong king regularly fractured the moment he died, as his sons divided the territory, the treasury, and the loyalty of the warrior class between them. The church existed in this world as a unique anomaly. It had survived the empire's fall structurally intact. Its bishops still held their sees. You see, its monasteries still operated, its councils still met, and its hierarchy still communicated across territories that no longer shared a common political authority. The Bishop of Rome, whom other bishops increasingly recognized as a figure of special prestige, if not yet of unambiguous supremacy, still corresponded with the bishops of Gaul, Spain, North Africa, and the East. The Church was the only institution in the post-Roman West that was genuinely trans-regional, that could send a letter from Rome to Lyon and expect it to be received by an organization that shared its assumptions, its language, and its loyalty. But the Church had no army. It had no tax collectors. It had no mechanism for enforcing its judgments on those who chose to ignore them, beyond the threat of spiritual sanction, excommunication, the denial of sacraments, with the declaration that a ruler stood outside the community of the faithful. Those sanctions were powerful only on people who believed they mattered. A king whose warriors did not share his faith or whose warriors were Arian Christians in a land of Catholic Romans could ignore the Bishop of Rome with complete practical impunity. The Church's authority was real, but it was floating, unanchored to any coercive power that could make it effective in the world. The theological division made this worse. Almost all of the Germanic peoples who established kingdoms in the former Western Empire had converted to Christianity before they arrived. But to Arian Christianity, a doctrine that had been declared heretical by the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD and again condemned by Theodosius in 380. The Arian position held that Christ was a created being, subordinate to the Father, a meaningful theological distinction, but more immediately, a political one. Arian Germanic kings ruled over Catholic Roman populations whose bishops answered to a Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy centered in Rome. The kings and the church were speaking different theological languages, and the distance between those languages was not merely doctrinal. It was a daily reminder that the rulers and the ruled inhabited different spiritual worlds. This is what destroyed most of the successor kingdoms. The Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Vandals in North Africa. Each built kingdoms that were militarily capable and administratively functional for a generation or two, but none of them solved the problem of legitimacy. They were Arian rulers over Catholic majorities. They were dynasties whose authority expired with the king who had earned it. They were foreign elites governing populations who did not share their religion, their language at home, or their kinship networks. They held power. They could not transmit it. And so they passed. The question that the post-Roman world posed to every Germanic dynasty, the question that most of them could not answer, was this: on what basis does a king rule people who are not his warriors, do not share his blood, do not speak his language, and do not worship his God? Military force could compel obedience. It could not produce loyalty. It could not make a bishop consecrate a king's authority. It could not make a Roman landowner identify his interests with those of his Frankish lord. Legitimacy was the problem. Not a political problem in the narrow sense, but a civilizational one. The Franks were the only dynasty that solved it, and the solution they built was so durable that it is still shaping the world 15 centuries later. They did not appear fully formed from the forests. The people who would eventually build medieval Europe had spent centuries on the periphery of Roman power, close enough to be shaped by it, far enough to remain something apart. The Franks were not a single tribe. They were a confederation, a loose and shifting alliance of smaller Germanic groups who lived along the lower Rhine, in the lands that now correspond to the Netherlands and the northwestern edges of Germany. Their name appears in Roman records for the first time in the 3rd century AD, used to describe the peoples pressing against the empire's northern frontier. What it meant, precisely, and was never quite settled, probably fierce, and later free. But the Romans knew what the word pointed to, and they were watching. The geography mattered more than it appears on a map. The Franks occupied the northern hinge of the Roman frontier, the point where the Rhine emptied toward the sea, where the flat lowlands of the north met the more navigable river country of Gaul, where the edge of Roman administration blurred into something less defined. It was not a position that made conquest easy, but it was a position that made contact inevitable. The Franks did not sit beyond Rome in ignorance. They lived inside its gravity, raiding its territory in times of weakness, serving in its armies in times of need, and absorbing its habits, its Latin, and its institutional logic across 200 years of proximity before the empire's western half collapsed. That proximity was not peaceful. In the mid-3rd century, Frankish groups pushed west across the Rhine into Roman Gaul, reaching as far as Spain, and in one extraordinary raid, seizing ships on the Spanish coast and launching attacks on North Africa. The Romans responded with punishing campaigns. In 289, the Frankish king Genobedes submitted to the emperor Maximian. In 307, Constantine the Great defeated the Bructeri, one of the Frankish subgroups, and subjected 2 of their leaders to a fatal public spectacle in the arena at Trier. The Romans were not being careless. The message was calibrated. The frontier would hold, but those who served within it would be rewarded. Reward for the Franks took a concrete and consequential form. Rather than simply killing or expelling the warriors they captured, the Romans began settling Frankish groups on Roman land under formal treaty arrangements, granting them territory in exchange for military service. These men became laity, bound to the land and to the obligation of defending it. The arrangement suited both sides. Rome got soldiers it desperately needed. The Franks got land, legal status, and a foothold inside the empire. The transaction was practical on its surface, but it carried a longer logic. The Franks were being taught at Roman expense how an empire administered itself. The decisive formal settlement came in 358, when the Emperor Julian granted the Salian Franks, the western branch of the Frankish confederation, official federati status and confirmed their right to settle in Belgic Gaul, the territory between the Meuse and Scheldt rivers, with their center at Tournai. They were no longer raiders tolerated at the border. They were allies with a treaty, a territory, and a legal identity within the Roman system. The Salians took this seriously. For more than a century afterward, they remained largely loyal to Rome, defending the frontier they had been given against the very peoples who would soon overwhelm it. Frankish loyalty to Rome was not sentimental. It was institutional. By the 4th century, Frankish commanders were embedded throughout the upper ranks of the Roman army in the West. In some held positions that would once have been unthinkable for men of Germanic origin. A young rhetorician in Milan, the future St. Augustine, was commissioned to write the official oration of praise for the consulship of a Frankish general named Baudo, a pagan from across the Rhine who had risen to one of the highest offices in the Roman state. The Franks were not watching Rome from outside. They were operating it from within, learning its hierarchies, its administrative habits, and its political culture at the level where those things were actually practiced. Childeric I, who died in 481 and whose son would become Clovis, was himself a Roman military commander. He held authority in the province of Belgica Secunda, not as an outsider permitted to operate there, but as an officer of the Roman state. This serving under the formal command structure that still nominally persisted in northern Gaul, even as it dissolved everywhere else. Childeric fought the Visigoths near Orleans in 463 on behalf of the Roman general Aegidius. He fought them again in 469. He cleared Saxon pirates from the coast near Angers. When he died, he was buried at Tournai in a tomb that held both the ornamented sword and gold jewelry of a Germanic warlord, and a seal ring inscribed with his name and title in the Roman manner. He was two things at once, and he managed the tension deliberately. The Frankish confederation that Childeric left to his son was not yet a kingdom in any unified sense. It was a collection of smaller Salian chieftaincies, each with its own leader, its own warrior band, and its own territorial base. The Ripuarian Franks, and settled along the middle Rhine around Cologne, were a separate grouping with their own internal hierarchies. The sense of shared Frankish identity, the idea that all these subgroups were part of one people, existed, but it had not yet produced a single political structure. What it had produced was a cultural common ground, shared law, memorized by law speakers and applied in assembly, shared customs around warfare, loyalty, and inheritance, and a shared relationship with the Roman frontier that had shaped all of them in similar ways. The law was both the system's strength and its deepest vulnerability. Frankish customary law was sophisticated for its context. It governed the settlement of disputes, the payment of compensation for injury and death, the Wehrgild, a system that assigned a precise monetary value to every free person based on their status, and the rules of inheritance. But the inheritance rules contained a structural fault that would haunt every Frankish dynasty for centuries. The kingdom was the personal property of the king, to be divided among his sons at his death, not the eldest son, all sons, equally. A king who unified a territory through 30 years of warfare and alliance building handed it to his sons as parcels, each son ruling his own piece, each piece immediately in competition with the others. This was not ignorance. It was logic. The logic of a society in which authority was personal, in which a warrior followed a man rather than an institution, and in which the only thing a father could do for his sons was give them each enough land and followers to survive. The problem was that the logic worked at the level of the individual family and destroyed the political structure at the level of the kingdom. Every generation of Frankish succession was, in effect, a controlled demolition of whatever the previous generation had built. A king who died with 3 sons left 3 sub-kingdoms whose rulers had every incentive to expand at each other's expense. Brotherhood was a genealogical fact. It was not a political constraint. The Franks also carried something that distinguished them from nearly every other major Germanic people of the 5th century, and that would eventually prove more important than their military capacity or their Roman connections. They had not converted to Arian Christianity. The Goths had been Christianized in the 4th century by the missionary Ulfilas, who translated the Bible into Gothic and spread a form of Christianity that the Council of Nicaea had already condemned as heretical. His influence extended outward to the Vandals, the Burgundians, and most of the other major Germanic confederations. By the time these peoples established their kingdoms inside the former Roman Empire, they were Arian, theologically separated from the Catholic populations they ruled, and institutionally at odds with the bishops who administered the church those populations belonged to. The Franks were pagan. Childeric I died a pagan. His burial at Tournai was a pagan burial surrounded by the grave goods of a Germanic warrior, horses, weapons, gold. Without a cross, without Christian ritual, without any of the ecclesiastical apparatus that a converted king would have required. Yet this was not a failure of civilization. It was, in retrospect, a preserved option. The Franks had not yet committed their theological capital. They had not yet chosen a Christianity that would put them at permanent odds with the Roman Church. When the moment came to make that choice, they would make it differently from everyone else. And the difference would be the hinge on which all of Western history turned. By the time Clovis inherited his father's position in 481, the Franks occupied a territory that was geographically central, institutionally literate in Roman practice, militarily capable, and theologically uncommitted. Every other Germanic kingdom in the former Western Empire was already defined by its limitations, by the Arian Gulf that separated its rulers from the Church. See, by the Mediterranean exposure that left it vulnerable to Byzantine reconquest, or by the ethnic distance between a tiny ruling elite and a vast Gallo-Roman population that had no reason to accept their authority as anything more than force. The Franks had none of those liabilities in the same degree. What Clovis inherited was not a kingdom. It was the raw material for one, and he knew exactly what to do with it. He was 15 years old when he inherited his father's position at Tournai in 481, and he ruled over a territory that was, by the standards of the post-Roman West, modest. The Salian Frankish chieftaincy Childeric had built was real, a functioning military structure with experienced warriors, treaty rights inside Roman territory, and a reputation that commanded respect along the northern frontier. But it was one Frankish power among several. Cararic held his own sub-kingdom and his own warriors. Ragnachar sat at Cambrai with his own retinue. Sigebert the Lame ruled the Ripuarian Franks on the Rhine. The Franks were not a united people under a single crown. They were a collection of related chieftaincies, each its own center of loyalty, each its own claim on the future. Clovis looked at this arrangement and understood it as a problem to be solved. The first solution was Soissons. In 486, 5 years into his reign, Clovis moved south against Syagrius, the son of the Roman general Aegidius, who had maintained a rump state between the Loire and the Somme that Roman sources called the domain of Soissons. Syagrius styled himself a Roman commander, and in a technical sense, he was. He governed a Gallo-Roman population, according to something resembling Roman administrative practice, in a territory that had preserved more of the Old World than almost anywhere else in the former Western provinces. He was the last piece of Roman authority in northern Gaul, and Clovis issued him a direct challenge: name the time and place of battle. Syagrius did. At Soissons, the Franks won. Syagrius fled to the Visigoths, who handed him over at Clovis's insistence. He was executed. The domain doubled the size of the Frankish territory overnight. The Soissons campaign was not simply a land grab, it was an institutional acquisition. The territory Clovis absorbed had Roman infrastructure, roads, administrative centers, Latin-literate clergy, and a Gallo-Roman landed aristocracy that had managed its own affairs under Roman law for centuries. These were people accustomed to being governed, not merely dominated. They had expectations. They had bishops. The bishops had networks. If Clovis wanted to rule this population rather than simply occupy it, he needed to offer those people something that Syagrius had been offering: continuity, order, protection, and he needed the church's cooperation to deliver it. Bishop Remigius of Reims understood this. He wrote to the young Frankish king early in his reign, before any conversion, advising him on how to govern, identifying the bishops as his natural counselors. The relationship did not begin with baptism. It began with a calculation. The woman Clovis married around 493 introduced a new pressure into that calculation. As Clotilde was a Burgundian princess and a Catholic, and she was persistent. She had their sons baptized. She argued the case for the Christian God in terms Clovis found politically interesting, if not yet personally compelling. He resisted, partly from genuine attachment to the Frankish tradition his warriors shared, partly from awareness that a religious conversion would fracture his army, whose pagan members might walk away from a king who abandoned their gods. Secrecy, when the moment finally came, wouldn't matter. The warriors had to be brought along. Clovis was not a man who moved faster than his political situation could absorb. The moment came at Tolbiac, around 496, during a battle against the Alemanni that was going badly. The Frankish line was breaking. In the disorder of a collapsing engagement, with his warriors retreating and the outcome no longer in his hands, Clovis made a vow to the god of Clotilde. If this god delivered victory, he would accept baptism and believe. The Alemanni were routed. Their leader was killed. The survivors submitted to Frankish authority. Clovis held the vow in front of him like a contract and honored it, not immediately, not carelessly, but with the deliberateness of a man who understood that what he was about to do would change the terms of his power permanently. The baptism itself took place on Christmas Day, the year debated among scholars, with 496 and 508 both plausible, in a small church near Reims, administered by Bishop Remigius. Clovis was baptized into Nicene Christianity, the Catholic faith of the Roman Church, not the Arian faith of the Goths and Vandals. Roughly 3,000 of his warriors were baptized alongside him. The secrecy Clovis had maintained beforehand gave way to a public, ceremonial event that was understood by everyone who witnessed it as something more than a religious rite. It was a declaration of political alignment. Avitus of Vienne, one of the most prominent bishops in Gaul, wrote to Clovis immediately afterward, praising his faith and mercy. The church knew exactly what had happened. What had happened was this: the only Germanic king in the former Western Empire who had not yet committed his theological allegiance had just committed it to the Roman Church. Every other major Germanic kingdom, Visigothic, Ostrogothic, Vandal, Burgundian, was Arian. Their rulers were permanently estranged from the Catholic bishops who served the majority of the populations they governed. Clovis had stepped across that divide in the other direction. He was now, in a single ceremony, the only Germanic king in the West whose faith matched the faith of his Gallo-Roman subjects, whose bishops were the same bishops that served the Roman Church, and whose authority the Pope in Rome had reason to support rather than merely tolerate. The Gallo-Roman aristocracy noticed. The bishops of Gaul noticed. These were men whose families had controlled the great episcopal sees, Paris, Tours, Sens, for generations, who held more real administrative authority in their territories than most Germanic warlords could claim, and who had been managing their relationship with Arian Germanic overlords with careful, ungrateful pragmatism. A Catholic king was something different. A Catholic king was someone they could advise, support, and work with without the permanent theological reservation that had marked every interaction with Arian rulers. The conversion did not simply change Clovis's relationship to the Church, it changed the Church's relationship to Frankish power, and with it, the political landscape of Gaul. The military consequences followed directly from the political ones. The Burgundians to the southeast were nominally Arian, though their population was Catholic. The Visigoths to the south controlled Aquitaine and a large slice of southwestern Gaul, and were among the most committed Arian powers in the west. For Clovis, these kingdoms were now not simply rivals, they were heretics governing Catholic populations who had reason to prefer Frankish rule. Gregory of Tours, writing decades later, presents Clovis's campaign against the Visigoths in explicitly religious terms. A Catholic king moving to liberate Catholic subjects from Arian oppression. The framing was retrospective, shaped by Gregory's ecclesiastical sympathies, but it captured something real. Clovis ordered his troops to abstain from plundering church property as he advanced south. This was not piety. This was strategy. He was not invading, he was arriving. At Vouillé in 507, the Frankish army met the Visigoths under King Alaric II near Poitiers. The battle was decisive. Alaric II was killed. The Visigoths broke and fled south toward Spain. Clovis seized Aquitaine, a vast, fertile, Gallo-Roman territory with its own established episcopal network, and added it to a kingdom that had, within a single generation, grown from a modest Salian chieftaincy in northern Belgium into the dominant power in Gaul. The emperor in Constantinople, Anastasius, sent Clovis the insignia of an honorary consulship. It was a symbolic gesture, but its symbolism was enormous. Clovis now held a Roman title. In the eyes of the Gallo-Roman population, he was not merely a Germanic warlord who had taken their territory. He was a consul, a Catholic king, a man whom the last emperor in the world had chosen to recognize. There remained the problem of the other Franks. Clovis's confederation was still not a single kingdom. Rival Frankish sub-kings held their own territories and their own claims. Charlemagne, who had watched the battle against Syagrius from a distance rather than commit his warriors, was now a liability. A man who had shown he would wait to see which way power fell rather than bind himself to it. Clovis captured him, tonsured him, and sent him to a monastery, where the loss of his royal Merovingian hair stripped him of his claim to rule. When Chararic's son was overheard threatening to grow his hair back and take revenge, Clovis had them both killed. The logic was clean. A man without hair could not lead Franks. A man who was dead could not grow hair. The elimination of rivals proceeded with the same cold clarity that had characterized every major decision Clovis had made since Soissons. Sigebert the Lame, king of the Ripuarian Franks, was maneuvered by Clovis into being murdered by his own son, Dixlodorus, who then found himself facing Clovis's agents, who killed him in turn. Clovis arrived at the Ripuarian court, expressed shock at the deaths, and was acclaimed by the Ripuarian Franks as their king. Ragnachar of Cambrai, whose warriors had once fought alongside Clovis, found himself betrayed. Clovis bribed Ragnachar's own retainers with what turned out to be gilded bronze rather than gold, had him seized, and executed him and his brother on the spot. By 509 or thereabouts, there was one Frankish king. Gregory of Tours notes, with almost no apparent irony, that Clovis was saddened in his later years that he had no close relatives left. He had ensured it personally. In 511, in the final months of his life, Clovis summoned the bishops of his kingdom to a council at Orléans. 33 canons were issued. That they regularized the relationship between the crown and the church, established protections for ecclesiastical property, confirmed the privileges of clergy, and created the first formal framework for how the Frankish king and the Catholic bishops would govern together. The First Council of Orleans was not a religious event in the narrow sense. It was a constitutional one. The moment at which the bargain Clovis had struck at his baptism was given institutional form. The Church would serve the kingdom. The kingdom would protect the Church. Neither would be fully free of the other again. Clovis died later that year, in November in Paris, and was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles. He was 45. He had remade the political geography of Western Europe in a single lifetime. Then, in the mechanism he had built to do it, the union of Frankish military power with Catholic ecclesiastical authority had only just begun to operate. What the baptism had actually established was not a Christian kingdom in the spiritual sense. It was a new kind of political legitimacy, one that drew its authority not from military strength alone, not from dynastic bloodline alone, but from the consecration of the Church, the approval of the Roman hierarchy, and the identification of Frankish kingship with the cause of Catholic Christianity, in a world where that cause still had millions of adherents and an institutional network that spanned the former Western Empire. Every other Germanic king who had converted to Christianity had converted to the wrong kind. Clovis had chosen the right kind, at the right moment, and with the right bishop standing over him. The difference between those two choices was the difference between the kingdoms that collapsed and the one that lasted. The bargain was real in both directions. The Church needed the Franks as much as the Franks needed the Church. The bishops of Gaul had authority without coercion, networks without armies, and institutional reach without the military force to protect it. Arian kings had never been reliable protectors. The theological distance was too wide, the mutual suspicion too persistent. Clovis offered something they had not had since the Western Empire fell, a Catholic king who would enforce church privileges with Frankish swords, absorb the Church's episcopal administration into his governance, and call councils where crown and clergy made decisions together. In accepting, the Church gave Clovis something no army could provide. It gave him the right to rule people who were not his warriors, the Gallo-Roman millions of Gaul, in a language those people understood and accepted. The sword had conquered the territory. The baptism had made it a kingdom. The tension that would define everything that followed was already present in the structure of the bargain itself. Clovis's legitimacy now rested on an institution he did not control. The bishops who had sanctified his kingship answered ultimately to a hierarchy whose center was not Tournai or Paris, but Rome. The Church that gave Frankish kings their sacred authority was the same Church that could, in principle, withdraw it. And every Frankish king who came after Clovis would inherit this tension between the power the Church gave them and the power the Church retained. It was not a flaw in the design. It was the design. The Franks had built a kingdom on a foundation of consecrated violence and shared institutional interest, and the question of who ultimately held the higher claim, king or bishop, sword or sacrament, would not be settled for another 3 centuries, and even then, not cleanly. The Merovingian Franks inherited something no Germanic people had ever possessed, a functioning institutional network that already covered their territory, already commanded the loyalty of the population, and already knew how to administer land, settle disputes, collect obligations, and project authority into villages where no Frankish warrior had ever set foot. Just the Catholic Church in Gaul did not need to be built. It was already there. The diocese, the administrative unit organized around a bishop, mapped almost exactly onto the old Roman civitas, the city district that had been Rome's basic unit of provincial administration, had survived the collapse of the Western Empire almost entirely intact. The bishops had inherited the buildings, the records, the networks, and the habit of authority. What they had lacked until Clovis was a king who shared their faith. After the baptism, that changed everything. The Merovingian kings and the Gallo-Frankish bishops needed each other with a clarity that neither side bothered to conceal. The king needed the bishops to govern the Gallo-Roman majority, the millions of Latin-speaking, tax-paying, and property-owning people of former Roman Gaul who were not Franks, and who would accept Frankish authority only if it came wrapped in the familiar language of Catholic legitimacy. The bishops needed the king to protect church property, enforce conciliar decisions, and provide the military weight that turned episcopal authority from a moral claim into a practical fact. The arrangement was not sentimental, it was structural, and the Merovingians used it accordingly. Royal control over the episcopate was the mechanism by which the Franks turned the church into an arm of governance. The king appointed bishops. Tradition held that a bishop should be elected by the clergy and people of the diocese. But in practice, following the establishment of Frankish kingship, it was the king who introduced the decisive element. A strong Merovingian king was master of his own church. The phrase belongs to the historian J. M. Wallace Hadrill, but the reality belongs to the 6th century. The bishops of Gaul were royal appointments as much as they were ecclesiastical ones, and the men who filled those positions were overwhelmingly drawn from the Gallo-Frankish aristocracy. The great landowning families whose sons moved between positions of secular and ecclesiastical power with the ease of men for whom the distinction between administration and ministry had never been entirely clear. The episcopal sees that mattered most, Paris, Reims, Tours, Metz, Lyon, became family holdings in everything but name. An aristocratic family that controlled a bishopric controlled the courts that settled property disputes, the institutions that maintained the only reliable records of land ownership, and the networks that connected the local population to the wider ecclesiastical hierarchy. The bishop of a major see was simultaneously a judge, a landlord, a diplomat, and the most powerful man in his city who was not a king. By the end of the 6th century, the count, the secular royal official appointed to govern a district, sometimes required episcopal approval to function. The church had not merely survived the post-Roman world. It had grown into the space the Roman state had vacated. Land was the material basis of all of this. The church in Merovingian Gaul accumulated land at a rate that transformed the economic landscape of the former Roman provinces. Frankish kings and aristocrats donated estates to bishoprics and monasteries in enormous quantities, partly from piety, partly from political calculation, and partly in the awareness that a gift to the church was a gift that came with permanent institutional memory attached. By the 7th century, the Catholic Church in Gaul probably controlled something close to a third of all productive land. That land generated income, labor, and obligation. The monasteries that managed much of it were not merely centers of prayer. They were agricultural enterprises, workshops, scriptoria, and the closest thing the early medieval world had to a functioning system of knowledge preservation and transmission. The monastery was the most important single institution the Frankish world produced. Monastic foundations spread across the Merovingian kingdom in the 6th and 7th centuries in two overlapping waves, one driven by the patronage of Merovingian royalty and Gallo-Frankish nobles eager to demonstrate piety and secure prayers for their souls, and one driven by the extraordinary energy of Irish missionaries, whose concept of monastic discipline was more rigorous and more intellectually demanding than anything the Frankish Church had previously known. When the Irish monk Columbanus arrived in Burgundy around 590 with 12 companions, the Frankish king received him and granted him an abandoned Roman fortress in the Vosges Mountains on which to found a monastery. Within years, the community at Annegray had outgrown its walls. A second house followed at Luxeuil, then a third at Fontaine. From Luxeuil alone, and at least 63 known missionaries went out to found more than 100 further monasteries across the Frankish world and beyond. The monasteries that Columbanus and his successors established were something new in the Frankish world. Institutions were the connection between spiritual rigor, education, and practical administration was treated as axiomatic. Columbanus believed that spiritual leadership and literacy were inseparable. His monasteries trained the men who would go on to serve as bishops and as administrators in the Frankish court, men who could read, write in Latin, keep records, draft correspondence, and apply logical reasoning to institutional problems. The Frankish kingdom had inherited no Roman administrative class. The monasteries were building one from scratch, generation by generation, yet inside the walls of communities that the kings had endowed and the church was running. The cult of the saints was the popular engine of all this institutional growth. In the post-Roman world, where the collapse of centralized administration had left populations without reliable access to courts, medicine, or security, the saints offered something Rome had once provided, a source of authority that could be appealed to, that was locally present, and that operated beyond the reach of any earthly power. The shrine of Saint Martin at Tours was the most important pilgrimage destination in Gaul, a place where the sick came hoping for healing, where the desperate came seeking intercession, and where bishops and kings came to demonstrate their proximity to sanctified power. Gregory of Tours, bishop of that city in the late 6th century, had made the cult of Martin the centerpiece of his authority. To control a saint's shrine was to control the territory around it. The Merovingian kings understood this perfectly. Sainthood was not merely a spiritual designation. It was a territorial claim. When a Frankish noble endowed a monastery and installed a saint's relics within it, he was establishing a permanent sacred presence on his land, one that drew pilgrims, generated income, anchored community loyalty, and placed his family in a relationship of patronage with a figure whose authority exceeded any king's. The promotion of saints' cults by Merovingian aristocratic families was simultaneously an act of piety and an act of territorial consolidation, and the two motivations were rarely distinguished because they were rarely in conflict. The church and the Frankish aristocracy were building the same thing, a landscape saturated with sacred authority in which every piece of land had a spiritual as well as a secular dimension. The deeper consequence of all this was that the Frankish kingdom was developing a kind of institutional depth that no other Germanic successor state had achieved. Roman provincial administration had provided depth of a different kind, the depth of a bureaucratic machine that could function independently of any individual. The Frankish system was not Roman. It did not have tax records, a professional civil service, or a standing army funded from central revenues. But it had bishops who knew their territories, monasteries that trained literate men, land grants that converted political loyalty into enduring institutional obligation, and a network of saints' cults that bound the population to a sacred geography controlled by people the king had appointed or approved. The system was not efficient by Roman standards. It was durable in ways Rome had never managed. The structural tension that Clovis had built into the bargain at Reims became more visible with every generation. The more land the church accumulated, the more powerful the bishops became, and the more indispensable to royal governance, which meant the more difficult to discipline or redirect. A Merovingian king who quarreled with his bishops found himself facing men who controlled the only literate administrative class in his kingdom, who managed a third of his territory's productive land, and who answered ultimately to a hierarchy whose loyalty ran to Rome as well as to him. The bishops could not be removed without disrupting the administration. They could not be ignored without surrendering the legitimacy the church provided. The Franks had made the church the foundation of their power. That foundation was becoming a load-bearing wall. By the late 6th and early 7th centuries, the episcopate had grown powerful enough that the line between the church governing the kingdom and the kingdom governing the church was genuinely difficult to trace. Bishops adjudicated disputes that secular courts could not handle. They managed food distribution in times of shortage. They negotiated with invaders on behalf of cities whose walls had crumbled. They minted coins. They commanded the loyalty of urban populations more completely than any count the king had appointed. The Frankish state was not running the church. The Frankish state and the church had become the same organism, two systems of authority so entangled that neither could be extracted from the other without destroying both. This was exactly what Clovis had intended. It was also, in ways no one had yet fully understood, the mechanism by which the Frankish kingdom would eventually be consumed by the thing it had built. The Merovingian bishops were not Rome's bishops. They were the Franks' bishops, appointed by Frankish kings, drawn from Frankish aristocratic families, managing Frankish territory. But they communicated in Latin with a Roman hierarchy, attended councils whose authority derived from Rome, and administered sacraments according to rites that the Bishop of Rome claimed ultimate authority to define. The church the Franks had absorbed was larger than the Franks, or it had existed before them and would continue after them. Every generation of Merovingian kings who filled the episcopal sees with their own men, who endowed monasteries with their own land, who used the church's institutional machinery to govern their own kingdom, was simultaneously strengthening an institution whose deepest loyalties and longest memories were not Frankish at all. The Frankish kingdom was, by the mid-7th century, the most institutionally complex polity in the former Western Empire. Not because the Franks had invented new institutions, but because they had made themselves indispensable to one that already existed, and then made it indispensable to them. Every other Germanic kingdom had remained a military structure resting on conquered land, and the Franks had become something else, a political system fused with an ecclesiastical one, each legitimizing the other, each dependent on the other, and each in its own way larger than the dynasty that claimed to rule them both. The fault line that Clovis had built into the Frankish kingdom ran through every generation that came after him. He had solved the legitimacy problem, the question of how a Germanic warlord could claim authority over people who were not his warriors, by fusing his dynasty to the church. But he had left the succession problem entirely intact. When he died in 511 and divided his kingdom equally among his 4 sons, he set in motion a pattern that would grind at the Merovingian dynasty for the next 2 centuries with the patience and certainty of a millstone. The sons fought. The grandsons fought. The great-grandsons fought. The kingdom fractured into sub-kingdoms, reunited under the strongest surviving claimant, and fractured again. The structural logic of partible inheritance had not been altered by baptism or by alliance with the church. It had simply been given larger territory to destroy. The most vivid expression of what this cost was the blood feud that consumed the Frankish kingdom in the last decades of the 6th century. Brunhilde was a Visigothic princess who had converted to Catholicism and married Sigebert I, king of Austrasia, the northeastern Frankish sub-kingdom centered on the Rhine valley. Fredegund was a woman of far lower birth who had clawed her way to the position of wife to Sigebert's brother Chilperic I, king of Neustria, by methods that began with the murder of Chilperic's previous wife. And the feud between these 2 women, which was also a feud between their husbands, their sons, their grandsons, and the aristocratic factions that attached themselves to each side, lasted nearly 40 years, filled the chronicles with assassinations and counter-assassinations, and ended only in 613 when Brunhilde, by then in her 70s and ruling through her great-grandsons, was seized by the Austrasian nobility, condemned for the deaths of 10 Frankish kings she had allegedly engineered, and subjected to a prolonged and fatal public sentence. The men who destroyed Brunhilde were revealing something more important than the outcome of a personal feud. They were demonstrating that the Frankish aristocracy had, across the 6th and 7th centuries, accumulated enough independent power to overthrow a ruling dynasty's regent and install the king of their choosing. The 2 men who led the revolt, Arnulf, Bishop of Metz, and Pepin of Landen, the leading magnate of Austrasia, were rewarded by the new king, Clothar II, with positions of extraordinary influence. Arnulf received the bishopric of Metz, the administrative and ecclesiastical heart of Austrasia. Pepin received the mayoralty of the palace in Austrasia. Neither man was a king. Between them, they controlled everything a king needed to function. The office of mayor of the palace had begun as a household management position, the senior official responsible for running the king's court, managing his estates, and overseeing the administrative apparatus that surrounded him. Yet by the 7th century, it had become something else entirely. The mayor controlled land appointments, managed the distribution of royal patronage, organized military campaigns, and served as the effective interface between the king and the great nobles whose loyalty the kingdom required. A strong king could keep his mayor subordinate. A child king could not. A king who came to the throne at 5 years old, surrounded by magnates whose families had spent 2 generations accumulating land and armed followers, governed in name only. The mayor governed in fact. The Merovingian dynasty produced a remarkable number of child kings in the 7th century. This was partly the result of dynastic bad luck. Kings dying young, leaving sons who were years from political maturity. But it was also the result of a structural dynamic that the succession custom had created. The more frequently the kingdom was divided among heirs, the smaller each heir's territory and treasure became. A king with less to distribute had less with which to buy the loyalty of the magnates around him. A king with less loyalty commanded less genuine obedience. A king who commanded less genuine obedience depended more heavily on his mayor to manage the nobles he could not manage himself. The process was self-reinforcing. Every generation of division made the next generation's king weaker, and every weaker king made his mayor more indispensable. Dagobert I, who died in 639, was the last Merovingian king who exercised genuine personal authority over the whole of the Frankish realm. He campaigned in Spain and against the pagan Slavs to the east. He reformed the law. He rebuilt the royal treasury. He made Paris the undisputed center of a court that still, under a capable king, functioned as an actual government. When he died, his sons, placed on their respective sub-kingdom thrones as children, found themselves unable to repeat what their father had done. The nobles of Austrasia and Neustria, who governed in their names, did not surrender their power when those children came of age. The habit of authority had transferred. The mayoralty had become the real office, and the kings had become its decoration. The family that would eventually replace the Merovingians did not emerge suddenly. They grew inside the system, generation by generation, the way a root grows inside a stone wall, slowly, invisibly. Then with eventual structural consequences. Arnulf of Metz and Pepin of Landen had sealed the alliance between their lines through marriage. Arnulf's son, Ansegisel, married Pepin's daughter Bega, and their son was Pepin of Herstal. This joining of the 2 most powerful Austrasian families into a single lineage gave their descendants a concentration of land, armed followers, episcopal connections, and institutional authority that no other Frankish family could match. When Pepin of Herstal led the Austrasian forces against the Neustrian mayor at the Battle of Tertry in 687 and won, he became the effective master of the entire Frankish realm, mayor of the palace in both kingdoms, controller of whatever Merovingian king happened to occupy the throne. The Carolingian family had arrived, though they did not yet have a name that history would remember them by. The position was not yet a dynasty. It was a personal domination held by Pepin through military success and political skill, and its continuity was not guaranteed. When Pepin died in 714, his legitimate heirs were still children, and his widow Plectrude moved to secure power for her grandsons. Into this gap stepped a man whose mother was Pepin's second wife or concubine, a status that Plectrude used to argue he had no claim, and who would spend the next 4 years fighting his way to sole control of the Frankish world, through a combination of military victories against both the internal Neustrian opposition and the external threats pressing against the kingdom's borders. His name was Charles. Later chroniclers, watching what he did with a battlefield, would call him Martel, the hammer. Charles Martel's path to power was not clean. He fought the Neustrian mayor Ragenfrid. He subdued rebellious Frankish nobles across Austrasia and Neustria. He campaigned against the Frisians to the north, the Saxons to the east, the Alemanni and Bavarians to the southeast, and the Muslim forces advancing from Spain through Aquitaine in the south. By 718, after 4 years of uninterrupted warfare, he controlled the Frankish realm as completely as Pepin of Herstal ever had. He then spent the next 2 decades consolidating that control with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterized every significant Frankish operator since Clovis. The difference was that Charles was not a king. He was a mayor. The Merovingian on the throne was real enough, a figure with long hair and ceremonial authority, but the kingdom's decisions were made elsewhere. The battle that history would remember as his greatest came in October 732, somewhere between Tours and Poitiers in the heart of Gaul. A Muslim army under Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, governor of Al-Andalus, had crossed the Pyrenees, sacked Bordeaux, shattered the forces of the Aquitanian Duke Eudes, and was advancing north, toward, among other targets, the shrine of Saint Martin at Tours, which was the wealthiest and most venerated site in Gaul. Charles marched south, avoided the Roman roads to preserve surprise, and met the Muslim army on ground of his choosing. After days of skirmishing, a full engagement broke the Muslim advance. Abd al-Rahman was killed. His army withdrew. When Charles had stopped the northernmost penetration of Muslim military force into Western Europe, and everyone in Gaul understood it immediately. The battle at Tours did something more than halt an invasion. It recast the terms of Charles's relationship with the Church and with the papacy. He was now the man who had defended Christendom, the protector of the shrine of Saint Martin, the hammer that had driven back the forces pressing against the Catholic world from the south. The bishops who had resented his seizure of church lands, which he had taken to fund the cavalry force that won at Tours, found their moral position significantly complicated. The Church could condemn a man who plundered ecclesiastical property. It was harder to condemn the same man for funding the army that had just saved the holiest shrine in Gaul from destruction. And Charles understood this perfectly. After Tours, he replaced the bishops of Tours and Poitiers, whose loyalty during the campaign he had found wanting, with men of his own choosing. He was not asking the Church's permission. The deeper consequence of Tours was institutional. Charles had demonstrated that the security of the Frankish Church, its lands, its shrines, its bishops, its entire physical existence, depended on military force that only his family controlled. The papacy in Rome, watching the Lombards press against the territories of central Italy and finding the Byzantine emperor increasingly distant and unreliable, was drawing its own conclusions. The man who had stopped the Muslim advance at Tours was the most powerful military figure in the Latin West. He was not a king. He did not hold the title that the Church's theology of sacred kingship required, but he held everything else. When Pope Gregory III sent a desperate embassy to Charles in 739 asking for military help against the Lombards, he was acknowledging a political reality that would reshape the Western Church within a generation. Charles Martel died in 741 without having claimed the Frankish crown. He had ruled as mayor, as duke, as the man behind the throne. But the Merovingian fiction of royal authority had served him as it had served his predecessors, providing a screen of legitimacy behind which real power operated. He was buried at Saint-Denis alongside the Merovingian kings, a placement that was its own kind of statement. His sons Charlemagne and Pepin divided his authority between them, as Frankish custom required. But the position they had inherited was not simply a mayoralty any longer. It was everything a kingdom needed except a name. The name was the last piece, and Pepin knew exactly where to go to get it. The Merovingian collapse was not a failure of individuals. It was the failure of a structural logic that had been present from the beginning. The logic of a kingship that rested on personal authority rather than institutional continuity, that divided its power with every succession, that made no distinction between the kingdom and the king's private property. The Frankish machine that Clovis had built was more durable than any of his successors. The church, the bishops, the monasteries, the episcopal networks, all of these had continued to function through 2 centuries of fratricidal war, child kings, and mayoral domination. What the Carolingian family understood, and what the Merovingians had never fully grasped, was that the machine needed a different kind of operator. Not a warlord who happened to be Catholic. A dynasty that made the church's authority and its own inseparable, that did not merely use the church as a tool, but presented itself as the church's indispensable instrument in the world. The next step was not a coup. It was a transaction. And the other party was in Rome. The battle the church and the Carolingian family would strike in the mid-8th century had been prepared by everything that had come before it. Clovis had established the principle that Frankish kingship required Catholic consecration. The Merovingian centuries had demonstrated that the church needed military protection it could not provide for itself. Charles Martel had demonstrated at Tours that the Carolingian family was the only power capable of providing it. All that remained was to formalize what was already functionally true, to give Pepin the title that matched the power he already held, and to give the Pope the alliance he already needed. The question was how to do it without destroying the legitimacy of the system both sides had spent 3 centuries building. The question Pepin sent to Rome around 750 was phrased with the care of a man who already knew the answer he needed. His envoys, Bursard, Bishop of Würzburg, and Fulrad, Abbot of Saint-Denis, carried to Pope Zacharias a single proposition disguised as a question. Is it proper that there should be kings in Francia who hold the royal title but possess no royal power, yet while those who hold all the power carry no royal title? The question was not a philosophical inquiry. It was a request for a ruling from the one institution in the Western world whose authority could reframe the terms of Frankish kingship without requiring a battlefield to do it. Zacharias understood exactly what was being asked, and he understood why the moment was one the papacy could not afford to waste. The Pope's answer was direct. It was not proper, he said, that the title should sit with one man and the power with another. The man who held the power should be called king. By apostolic authority, he decreed that Pepin should be made king of the Franks. The ruling was not a command issued to an obedient subject. It was a constitutional judgment delivered by the one office in the Latin West that could claim the authority to make such judgments, the office that had, since the time of Clovis, been the source of the sacred legitimacy that Frankish kings required to rule people who were not their warriors. Zacharias had just given Pepin everything he needed. In return, Pepin would give the papacy something it needed more urgently than legitimacy. It needed an army. The Lombards were the problem. The Lombard kingdom in northern Italy had been pressing southward against the territories of central Italy for decades, and by 751, the same year Pepin acted, the Lombard king Aistulf had taken Ravenna, expelling the last representative of Byzantine authority from northern Italy and cutting Rome off from the Eastern Empire that had nominally been its protector. The Pope was now surrounded, Lombards to the north, Lombards to the south through Spoleto, and an Eastern emperor in Constantinople who was both too distant and too entangled in the iconoclast controversy to send meaningful military help. Zacharias' successor, Stephen II, looked at the map of Italy and understood that Rome's survival as an independent institution depended on a power whose armies actually existed and could reach the peninsula before the Lombards did. There was only one such power in the Latin West. In November 751, in the city of Soissons, Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, the man whose position had been a fiction for a decade, was brought before an assembly of Frankish nobles and bishops. He was tonsured. The long hair that had been the physical mark of Merovingian royal blood since the dynasty's foundation, the hair whose cutting had always been the instrument of political emasculation, the ritual that said a man was finished as a king, was cut from his head. He was sent to a monastery. Pepin was then elected king of the Franks by the assembled nobles, consecrated by the bishops, and raised on a shield in the Germanic custom. Archbishop Boniface, the great Anglo-Saxon missionary who had spent decades reforming the Frankish church under Carolingian patronage, performed the anointing. The ceremony drew on the most ancient imagery the church possessed: the prophet Samuel anointing Saul, Samuel anointing David, the oil of God's selection running down the neck of a man chosen to lead his people. Pepin was not merely a king, he was the Lord's anointed. The anointing changed the constitutional basis of Frankish kingship in a way that no military victory or dynastic claim could have accomplished. Clovis had been baptized into Catholic Christianity, which had given him access to the church's networks and the loyalty of the Gallo-Roman population. But Clovis had not been anointed by a bishop at the moment of his investiture. His kingship had rested on election by his warriors, military success, and the church's subsequent endorsement. Pepin's kingship rested on something different: the explicit, prior, theological ratification of the church, delivered through the physical act of anointing, which placed the new king inside a biblical lineage of sacred rulers, chosen not by their followers, but by God. A king who had been anointed could not simply be deposed by a stronger rival. To unseat him was to unseat God's choice. The church had made Frankish kingship sacred in a new and much more durable way. 3 years later, the arrangement was formalized at a ceremony that had no precedent in the history of the Western Church. Pope Stephen II, Zacharias, had died before he could see what the exchange he had ratified had set in motion, crossed the Alps in the winter of 753 into Frankish territory. It was the first time a pope had ever crossed the Alps. The enormity of the act was not lost on anyone who witnessed it. The Bishop of Rome, the inheritor of the authority of St. Peter, now had left the city his office was anchored to and traveled through the mountain passes of winter to prostrate himself before a Frankish king and beg for military help. Stephen met Pepin at the royal estate of Ponthion on January 6, 754. He came in penitent's clothing. He threw himself on the ground before Pepin and remained there until Pepin dismounted and raised him up. The image was carefully constructed. It was also completely sincere. In the summer of 754, at the Basilica of Saint-Denis near Paris, the church that had been the burial site of the Merovingian kings and the spiritual center of the Frankish royal cult, Stephen II anointed Pepin a second time. He anointed Pepin's queen, Bertrada. He anointed Pepin's 2 sons, Charles, who was approximately 12 years old, and the younger Charlemagne. And the anointing of the sons was a theological and political statement of extraordinary precision. It declared that the sacred kingship the Pope had just confirmed was not a personal grant to one man for his lifetime. It was a dynastic consecration, a declaration that this family, this bloodline, was the chosen instrument of God's authority in the Frankish world, and that no other family could legitimately replace them. Stephen then formally forbade the Franks ever to choose a king from any lineage other than the Carolingians. The Pope had just placed the new dynasty under his personal protection and placed his personal protection under God's. Pepin received the title Patricius Romanorum, Patrician of the Romans. It was a title that had previously belonged to the Byzantine emperor's representative in Italy, kept the man who administered the territories of the Western Church on behalf of Constantinople. By giving it to Pepin, Stephen was declaring something that the politics of the moment made unavoidable, but that was nonetheless revolutionary. Rome no longer looked east for its protector. The authority that the Byzantine Empire had once exercised over the papacy's physical security was now being transferred to a Frankish king. The Roman Church and the Frankish kingdom had fused their strategic interests into a single institutional frame, and the Byzantine emperor, who sent envoys racing across the Alps to intercept the proceedings and found himself ignored, was watching his role in Western affairs expire in real time. Pepin honored the arrangement with 2 military campaigns into Italy. In 755, then the Frankish army crossed the Alps through the Mont Cenis Pass, defeated Aistulf's Lombard forces near Susa, and compelled the Lombard king to swear an oath of peace and promise the return of the territories he had seized from Rome. Aistulf broke the oath almost immediately. In 756, Pepin returned, defeated Aistulf a second time, besieged him at Pavia, and this time imposed terms that the Lombards could not easily escape. The Exarchate of Ravenna, the territories that had been the administrative heart of Byzantine Italy, was formally transferred not to the Byzantine emperor, whose envoys arrived and were politely sidelined, but to the Roman Church. Pepin's envoys, according to one account, laid the keys of the surrendered cities on the tomb of St. Peter. The territories that changed hands in 756 became the material basis of the Papal States, the independent territorial sovereignty of the papacy that would endure in various forms for more than 11 centuries. What the Church received from Pepin's campaigns was not simply land. It was political existence as an independent actor in the world. The ability to govern a territory, collect revenues, field a local administration, and engage in diplomacy from a position of territorial standing rather than mere spiritual authority. The papacy had always claimed to be the highest authority in the Christian world. Now, it had the ground under its feet to prove it. That ground had been purchased with Frankish swords on Italian soil at the direction of a Frankish king who had himself been crowned by the Pope who needed those swords. The transaction of 751 to 756 was the most consequential political exchange of the early medieval West, and its consequences operated in both directions simultaneously. Pepin had received from the Church a form of legitimacy that no Germanic warlord had ever possessed, a sacred kingship rooted in biblical precedent, ratified by the institution that claimed divine authority on earth and extended to his dynasty in perpetuity. The Church had received from Pepin a military protector, a territorial endowment, and a constitutional framework in which the Pope held the authority to designate kings. Each party had given the other what it could not provide for itself. Each party had also surrendered something it would spend the next several centuries trying to recover. What Pepin had surrendered, without fully understanding the long-term implications, was the Frankish tradition of kingship as a purely internal Frankish matter. Before 751, a Frankish king's authority rested on the consent of his warriors, his military success, and the Church's blessing after the fact. After 751, a Carolingian king's authority rested in part on a papal ratification that the papacy could, in principle, extend or withhold. The Pope had decreed that Pepin should be king. A future pope could, in principle, decree that a future Carolingian should not be. The authority that made the Carolingian dynasty sacred was not Carolingian. It was Roman. What the papacy had surrendered was its position as a purely spiritual institution operating above the realm of political calculation. By crossing the Alps, by prostrating itself before a Frankish king, by exchanging anointing for military campaigns, the papacy had entered into an arrangement whose terms were explicitly transactional. It had accepted territorial gifts from a secular ruler, which meant it now had secular interests to protect and secular obligations to its protector. The church that Pepin's grandfather Charles Martel had plundered for military funding was the same church whose pope was now begging Pepin's son for armed intervention in Italy. The distance between those two moments, between Charles Martel ignoring Pope Gregory III's request for help and Stephen II prostrating himself before Pepin at Pontillon, was only 15 years. The speed of the reversal captured how completely the strategic situation had changed and how completely both parties had adapted to it. The 12-year-old boy who had been anointed at Saint-Denis in the summer of 754, who had stood beside his father while the Pope of Rome placed oil on his head and declared him and his line the sacred kings of the Franks, that boy was watching. He was learning. When Pepin died in 768 and divided his kingdom between his two sons in the Frankish custom, the younger Charlemagne took his portion and the elder Charles took his. Charlemagne died 3 years later, in 771, and Charles absorbed his brother's territories, becoming the sole king of the Franks. He already understood from everything he had witnessed and everything his father had built that the bargain between the Frankish crown and the Roman Church was the load-bearing structure of the entire system. What he did not yet know, what no one could have predicted from the events of 751, was how far he was about to take it. He became sole king of the Franks in 771 when his brother Charlemagne died, and Charles absorbed his territories without ceremony or negotiation. He was somewhere around 29 years old. His father had given him the anointed title, the Papal Alliance, and the Frankish machine in its most developed form. What Charles added was something the machine had been waiting for since Clovis: a single operator of absolute personal competence who understood every component of it: the military, the ecclesiastical, the administrative, and the diplomatic, and who was willing to run all of them simultaneously, at scale, for more than 4 decades. The kingdom Pepin had left was the most powerful polity in the Latin West. The empire Charles would build from it would have no precedent in the West since Rome. He struck north first. Saxony was the oldest unfinished business on the Frankish frontier, a vast territory of forested river valleys and dispersed settlements east of the Rhine, inhabited by a people who had resisted every Frankish incursion for generations and who remained what the Franks had once been: pagan, ungoverned by any central authority, and deeply hostile to the Christianity that Frankish missionaries had been attempting to plant in their territory for decades. In 772, Charles led the first of what would become 18 campaigns into Saxon territory over 32 years. The immediate provocation was a Saxon raid on a church at Deventer. The real purpose was the permanent incorporation of Saxony into the Frankish system, which meant, none in practice, military conquest followed by forced conversion, followed by the installation of an episcopal infrastructure that would hold the territory in place after the army had moved on. The Saxon wars were unlike any campaign the Franks had previously fought. Other peoples, the Lombards, the Alemanni, the Burgundians, had possessed central authorities that could be defeated, leaders who could be captured or compelled to submit, administrative structures that could be absorbed. The Saxons had none of these. They were organized at the level of the tribal subgroup, which meant that a Frankish army that defeated one Saxon alliance found itself the following year facing a different configuration of the same people. Saxony could not be conquered in the way that a kingdom could be conquered. It had to be transformed, its population converted, its leadership replaced or neutralized, its religious and cultural identity dismantled and rebuilt around the Frankish institutional model. The process required every tool Charles possessed, and it consumed most of his reign. The first major turning point came in 772, when Charles advanced to the Irminsul, a great pillar that stood at the center of Saxon sacred geography, the axis around which their religious world was organized. He destroyed it. The act was understood on both sides as exactly what it was, not a military operation, but a civilizational declaration. The Franks were not arriving to negotiate. They were arriving to replace. What followed was a cycle of Frankish advance, Saxon submission, Frankish withdrawal, Saxon revolt, and Frankish return that played out across 3 decades with grinding, exhausting regularity. Each cycle ended with more Saxon territory under Frankish administration, more Saxon nobles dead or displaced, and more Saxon settlements, with a Frankish appointed priest standing in a church that had not existed 5 years before. The laws Charles issued for Saxony, the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxonia, promulgated in the early 780s, were the most severe legal instrument the Frankish state had ever produced, and they revealed with unusual clarity what the Frankish system looked like when it was operating at full coercive force. The penalty for destroying a church was death. The penalty for killing a priest was death. The penalty for cremating the dead in the pagan manner was death. The penalty for refusing baptism for a Saxon who had been presented with the Christian faith and declined it was death. Charlemagne's advisor Alcuin of York objected that forced conversion had no theological value since faith required genuine assent. Charles acknowledged the argument and continued the policy. The conversion of a population was not, in his understanding, primarily a spiritual operation. It was an administrative one. The rebellion that erupted in 782 was the Frankish system's most dangerous single moment in 30 years of Saxon warfare. Widukind, the one Saxon noble who had consistently refused to appear before Charles at his assemblies, who had fled to Denmark rather than accept Frankish authority, and who returned whenever the opportunity presented itself, led an alliance of Saxon forces that destroyed a Frankish army in the Suntal Hills while Charles was campaigning elsewhere. The Frankish dead included senior court officials. Charles moved north with whatever forces he could gather quickly, assembled the Saxons who had submitted to his authority, and demanded the surrender of those responsible. 4,500 men were handed over. He ordered their mass execution at Verden, on the Aller. The royal Frankish annals record the sentence in a single sentence. There is no elaboration. Verden did not break Saxon resistance. It intensified it, producing 2 further years of continuous warfare that required Charles to winter in Saxony itself. An almost unprecedented commitment of royal time and military resources. No, what eventually broke the resistance was not the massacre, but its opposite, the baptism of Widukind at Adigny in 785, with Charles standing as his godfather. Pope Hadrian I ordered prayers and celebrations throughout Christendom. The meaning was precisely calculated. A man who accepted baptism accepted not merely a religious rite, but a political identity, a place inside the Frankish system, a set of obligations to king and church, and a set of protections that the system provided in return. Widukind's baptism transformed the most effective enemy the Saxons had produced into a subject of the Frankish crown. He disappears from the historical record almost immediately afterward. While Saxony absorbed the bulk of Charles's military attention, the Lombard question in Italy required its own resolution. So Pope Hadrian I had expelled Lombard officials from Rome and found himself facing the military response of Lombard king Desiderius, who marched to within a day's march of the city. Hadrian sent for Charles. In 773, the Frankish army crossed the Alps, descended into the Po Valley, and laid siege to Pavia, the Lombard capital. The city held for 9 months before hunger forced Desiderius to surrender. Charles took the Lombard crown for himself, added Rex Langobardorum to his titles, and confirmed the territorial grants his father had made to the papacy. He was now king of the Franks and king of the Lombards, 2 crowns on the same head and a territorial reach that extended from the North Sea to the Adriatic. Spain produced the greatest single failure and the strangest single legend of Charles's career. In 778, invited by Muslim governors in the northeast of the Iberian Peninsula who wanted Frankish help against the Umayyad emir of Córdoba, Charles led 2 armies across the Pyrenees. Zaragoza, whose governor had promised to open its gates, refused to surrender. After a month of unsuccessful siege, Charles accepted gold and hostages and withdrew. On the return through the Pyrenees, as his army descended the narrow defile of Roncesvalles Pass, the rearguard was ambushed by Basque warriors who exploited the terrain with the precision of men who had grown up in it. The baggage train was plundered. Among the dead was a Frankish commander named Roland, prefect of the Breton March. The chroniclers noted it. 3 centuries later, the story had become an epic, the Song of Roland, in which the Basque ambush had been transformed into a Muslim attack. Find and Roland had become the archetypal Christian knight who died defending Christendom. The transformation of a military embarrassment into a founding myth of Christian chivalry was one of the more remarkable acts of institutional memory the Carolingian world produced. The Spanish March that eventually emerged from further campaigns in the 790s and early 800s. A defended buffer zone along the southern face of the Pyrenees, incorporating Catalonia and parts of what is now northeastern Spain, was a more modest achievement than Charles had envisioned in 778, but it was also more durable. The march was governed by Frankish counts, defended by Frankish garrisons, and administered by bishops appointed through the same system that operated everywhere else in the empire. It was the same template applied at the western frontier that had been applied at the eastern and northern ones. Conquest, conversion, episcopal installation, administrative integration. The machine had one mode of operation, and it applied it everywhere. The Avars presented the eastern version of the problem Saxony had presented in the north. These were a Central Asian people who had established themselves in the Pannonian Plain, the great lowland basin of what is now Hungary, and had been raiding Frankish frontier territories with a regularity that Charles finally decided to address permanently in 791. The Avar political structure was built around a fortified central compound that the Franks called the Ring, a legendary stronghold of concentric earthwork walls that had protected the accumulated plunder of generations of Avar raids across Central Europe. Between 791 and 796, the Frankish and allied forces dismantled the Avar kingdom piece by piece. The ring was breached and sacked. The treasure it contained, the product of 2 centuries of raiding, was distributed by Charles to his churches, his monasteries, and his key supporters across the empire. Bishops were installed in newly created sees on former Avar territory. The Pannonian Basin was opened for Frankish administration and Christian mission. What the campaigns produced, taken together, was not simply territory. It was a demonstration of what the Frankish machine could accomplish when it operated at full capacity with a single competent director. Every conquest ended the same way. Military submission, followed by the installation of a bishop, followed by the legal integration of the new population into the Carolingian framework of rights and obligations. The bishop was not a spiritual consolation prize awarded after the real work was done. He was the real work. The Frankish army could hold a territory for a campaign season. The bishop could hold it for generations. The missi dominici, paired royal agents, typically 1 layman and 1 cleric, who toured the empire in circuits to enforce the king's laws, hear complaints, and report abuses back to the palace, extended Charles's administrative reach into corners of the kingdom that no army ever visited. The capitularies, the written royal decrees that accumulated across his reign into something approaching a systematic legal code, were read aloud at local assemblies in every region of the empire, in the Latin that the palace school at Aachen was ensuring that more and more of the clergy could understand. The palace school itself was an expression of something Charles understood that most medieval rulers did not, that administration is a technology, and technologies require trained operators. He gathered scholars from across the Latin world, Alcuin from York, Theodulf from Spain, Paul the Deacon from Lombardy, and Einhard from the Frankish heartland, and set them to work not merely on theology and poetry, but on the standardization of the Latin script, the correction of liturgical texts, and the training of the men who would carry Carolingian governance into the next generation. The Caroline minuscule script that his court produced became the standard written hand of the medieval West, and, via the humanists who rediscovered it in the 15th century, the ancestor of the typeface you are reading now. The Frankish machine did not merely conquer territories. It produced the intellectual infrastructure that would govern them. The system Charles was building was the largest and most institutionally sophisticated political structure the Western world had seen since the fall of Rome. It was also in ways that were becoming clearer with each passing decade. A structure whose coherence depended almost entirely on the man at its center. The Missi Dominici worked because Charles kept generating capitularies that gave them clear instructions. The bishops installed in conquered territories stayed aligned with Frankish authority because Charles maintained the personal relationships, the patronage networks, and the military capacity to make alignment attractive and defection dangerous. The palace at Aachen, the great complex Charles had built on the model of late Roman imperial architecture, with a throne room and a Palatine chapel that made explicit claims about what kind of ruler this was the node through which everything passed. Remove the node, and the network would face a question it had not yet been designed to answer. What happens to a system built for one man when the man is gone? None of this was visible as failure while Charles was alive. What was visible was an empire that stretched from the Elbe to the Ebro, from the North Sea to the edge of the Adriatic, unified under a single Christian king whose authority had been ratified by the Pope, maintained by the most sophisticated administrative apparatus the early medieval world had produced, and embedded in an ecclesiastical network that reached into every village and settlement of the former Western Empire's core territories. It was, by any reasonable measure, the most extraordinary political achievement since Augustus. And the question that everyone around Charles was beginning to ask, the question that the Pope in Rome had been asking for years, was whether there existed a title adequate to what he had built, and whether the man who bestowed such a title would thereby become greater than the man who received it. Charles himself had not yet answered that question. But Christmas was coming, and Rome already knew what it intended to do. The Frankish system's logic of sacred violence, conquest followed by conversion followed by episcopal administration, had produced a Christian civilization that bore the Frankish stamp on every institution from the Rhine to the Ebro. But the stamp was not permanent in the way Charlemagne assumed it was. Every bishop installed in a conquered territory was a man who answered ultimately to a hierarchy whose center was Rome. And every monastery endowed with Carolingian land was an institution whose deepest institutional memory ran centuries before the Carolingians arrived. The machine Charles had inherited and perfected was more durable than any dynasty. In building it to its maximum capacity, he had created the conditions in which the dynasty itself was no longer the most important thing inside it. The crisis that brought Charlemagne to Rome in the winter of 800 had begun, as so many crises of the early medieval church did, with an act of violence that was also an act of institutional argument. On April 25, 799, Pope Leo III was riding in procession through the streets of Rome when armed men, agents of the Roman nobility, the powerful families who had watched Leo's elevation to the papacy with the contempt that established aristocracies reserved for men who rise without their permission, pulled him from his horse and subjected him to a brutal physical assault intended to permanently silence and disfigure him. The specific severity of the assault was deliberate. A pope who was blind and mute was a pope who could not function, and a pope who could not function was a pope who could be replaced. Leo survived, escaped, and rode north. The Alps were no longer the barrier they had once been to a pope who needed Frankish protection. He found Charles at his camp at Paderborn, prostrated himself, and waited. What happened at Paderborn between Leo and Charles is not recorded in any source that both parties would have endorsed. Yet what is visible in the outcome is that Leo was escorted back to Rome by a Frankish commission that discredited the charges against him and deported his accusers, and that Charles himself followed to Rome in November 800 to preside over the final resolution of the matter. He convened a council in December. He made clear that no earthly authority could judge the apostolic see. He accepted Leo's sworn oath of innocence, delivered on December 23rd, as the formal conclusion of the inquiry. The charges were dismissed, the accusers were gone, the Pope was restored. 2 days later, Charles went to Christmas Mass at St. Peter's Basilica. What happened at that Mass has generated more historical argument than almost any other single event of the early medieval world. As Charles rose from his prayers at the tomb of St. Peter, and Leo placed a crown on his head, and the gathered Romans acclaimed him Emperor and Augustus. The title had not existed in the West since Odoacer had sent the imperial insignia east in 476. It now existed again, conferred by a pope on a Frankish king, in a ceremony that neither the Frankish annals nor the papal Liber Pontificalis described in quite the same way. The Frankish account noted the placement of the crown and the change of title almost as an aside, emphasizing that the decisive element was the acclamation of the gathered Frankish nobility. The papal account was more explicit. Leo had crowned Charlemagne, and the act was done by the will of God and St. Peter. The difference between those two descriptions was not stylistic, it was constitutional. Einhard, Charles's biographer, and a man who knew him personally for decades, recorded that Charles had no foreknowledge of what the Pope intended, and that if he had known, he would not have entered the church that day. Modern historians have debated whether this is literally true, whether the most strategically sophisticated ruler in the Western world was genuinely surprised by a ceremony that everyone around him had almost certainly been discussing for months, or whether it was a carefully constructed claim designed to establish that Charles had not sought the title from the Pope and was therefore not beholden to the Pope for possessing it. The ambiguity was almost certainly intentional. Charles wanted the title. He did not want the title on the Pope's terms. The distinction between receiving a crown and accepting one placed on you by surprise was the difference between dependence and independence. And Charles understood the constitutional stakes as well as anyone. The imperial title meant different things to different audiences, and all of those meanings were operative simultaneously. For the Frankish nobility, it was a confirmation of what they already knew, that the empire Charles had built was the largest and most powerful political structure in the Western world, and that its ruler deserved a title adequate to that fact. For the Gallo-Roman population, the Latin-speaking millions who still carried the memory of Rome in their institutions, their church, and their legal culture. It was a restoration, the return of an imperial authority to the West after 3 centuries of its absence. For the papacy, it was something more specific and more consequential. It was the establishment of a precedent. The Pope had placed the crown on the emperor's head. That act, once performed, became the template. Every future coronation that followed it would be measured against the moment Leo had reached down and touched Charles's brow with gold. The Byzantine reaction was precisely what Charles had anticipated and feared. Constantinople regarded the coronation as illegal, offensive, and absurd in roughly equal measure. There was one Roman Empire. It existed. Its emperor was in Constantinople. The fact that its current occupant was a woman, Empress Irene, who had violently deposed and permanently incapacitated her own son Constantine VI in 797 to rule in her own name, was, from the Byzantine perspective, an internal dynastic matter that did not create a vacancy in the imperial office that a Frankish king could fill. Some Western arguments held that a woman's rule was constitutionally impossible and that the throne was therefore genuinely vacant. The Byzantines found this reasoning creative rather than compelling. They had been the Roman Empire for 300 years since the western provinces had collapsed. A Frankish warlord with a pope's crown did not change that. The proposal that followed, reported by Charlemagne's court scholar Alcuin and taken seriously by at least some participants, was that Charles should marry Irene. thereby reuniting the two halves of what had once been a single empire under the shared authority of a Christian household. Alcuin had been speaking of an imperium Christianum, a unified Christian empire in which all the faithful would be bound as they had once been bound by Roman citizenship. Yes, a marriage between Charles and Irene was one mechanism by which that vision might have been given institutional form. The negotiations were real enough to be recorded. Their outcome was foreclosed by a revolution in Constantinople in 802 that deposed Irene and installed a new emperor, Nikephoros I, who had no interest in the arrangement and less in recognizing Charles's title. The two empires remained separate. The tension between them would persist for generations. What the coronation had produced, regardless of who had planned what, regardless of what Charles had or had not known when he walked into St. Peter's Basilica, was a structural problem that would not be resolved in his lifetime or for centuries after it. The Pope had crowned the emperor. The act implied a relationship. If the Pope could grant the imperial title, the Pope could in principle withhold it, condition it, or revoke it. The papacy would spend the next several hundred years insisting on exactly this interpretation. The emperors of the West, Charles's successors, and the German kings who eventually inherited the title through the Holy Roman Empire, would spend the same several hundred years insisting that the coronation had been an act of recognition, not creation, that the emperor's power came from God directly, and that the Pope had merely made the divine choice visible in ceremony. The conflict between those two positions, Pope and Emperor, sacerdotium and imperium, the sword of spiritual authority and the sword of temporal power, would be the defining constitutional argument of medieval Western civilization, and it was born in the moment Leo reached for that crown. Charles's response to the contradiction was immediate and characteristically precise. He used the imperial title. He deployed it in diplomacy, in correspondence, and in the administration of his territories. He negotiated with the Byzantines from the position it gave him. And when, in 813, he decided to crown his son Louis as co-emperor to secure the succession, he arranged the ceremony with deliberate care at the Palatine Chapel in Aachen. Not at St. Peter's in Rome, not in the presence of a pope, and not in a form that could be interpreted as papal conferral. Louis stood before his father and the assembled Frankish nobility. Charles placed the crown on his son's head himself. The constitutive act was the father's will and the nobility's acclamation. The pope was not present. The message was explicit. The emperor makes emperors. What the papacy witnessed, it did not create. The imperial coronation of 800 was a moment of genuine historical rupture, an event after which the political and ecclesiastical landscape of the Western world was permanently altered, but it was also a moment whose meaning was unstable from the instant of its occurrence. Both parties needed it to mean something different, and both parties immediately set about constructing the account that supported their interpretation. The Frankish version emphasized Charles's existing power, the acclamation of the nobility, and the Pope's secondary role as a celebrant rather than a creator. The papal version emphasized Leo's initiative, the act of crowning, and the implication that what the Pope had given the Pope could take away. Neither version was simply false. The ceremony had been constructed in a way that made both readings available, probably because neither party had been willing to foreclose the other's interpretation in advance and risk losing the arrangement altogether. The Frankish nobility watched all of this with the particular attention of men whose own interests were directly implicated. A Frankish emperor was a different thing from a Frankish king in ways that affected their relationships to each other and to the crown. The imperial title implied a kind of universal authority, a claim to govern not just the Franks, but all the Christian peoples of the West, that was both grander and more dangerous than anything the Merovingian kings had ever claimed. It was grander because it placed the Frankish political achievement inside the most prestigious historical tradition the Western world possessed. It was more dangerous because it raised expectations about what an emperor was supposed to do, and b, that a king who happened to be very successful had never needed to meet. The title committed Charles's successors to something his campaigns had built, but that his administration had never fully institutionalized. The woman on the Byzantine throne, whose existence had provided the theological justification for the coronation, was gone by 802, deposed and replaced. The Frankish-Byzantine negotiations that had briefly promised a resolution to the constitutional contradiction the coronation had created came to nothing. The two empires settled into a wary mutual recognition. The Byzantines eventually acknowledged Charles's imperial title in 812 in a formula that stopped well short of calling him Emperor of the Romans. And the structural tension between Rome and Constantinople, between the Latin West and the Greek East, deepened into the permanent civilizational divide that would eventually produce the Great Schism of 1054. Charlemagne died in January 814, 14 years after the coronation, at his palace in Aachen. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, old for the era, and old for a man who had spent most of his life conducting military campaigns across a territory the size of a continent. Einhard recorded his last days with the precision of a man who had been present for them. The fever, the pleurisy that followed, the refusal to eat more than minimal food, the final communion, the death. He was buried at Aachen in the church he had built. The empire he had left behind was the largest and most institutionally sophisticated polity the Western world had possessed since Rome. It was also, as his successors would discover almost immediately, a structure whose coherence had rested in ways no one had fully understood on the particular genius of the man who ran it. The coronation of 800 was, in the end, the moment at which the 3-century project of the Frankish state reached its formal culmination. Clovis had baptized himself into a Catholic identity and thereby separated the Franks permanently from every other Germanic people. Pepin had exchanged that identity for a papal anointing and thereby transformed Frankish kingship from a military fact into a sacred one. Charles had taken both of those precedents to their logical conclusion and become, in the eyes of the Latin West, the successor of Augustus, the protector of Peter, and the emperor of the Christian world. The machine that Frankish warlords had been building for 3 centuries had produced, in this moment, something none of them had set out to produce: an institution, the Western imperial title held by papal sanction, that was larger than any dynasty, more durable than any army, and more consequential than any single reign. The contradiction it contained was not a flaw in the design. It was the design's most important feature, and it would drive the politics of Western Europe for the next 500 years. The empire Charles left behind in January 814 was the most institutionally sophisticated political structure the Western world had possessed since Rome, and it was, from the moment of his death, in the process of being unmade by the same structural logic that had undone every Frankish dynasty before it. Charles had understood this. In the final years of his reign, watching his other sons die, Pepin of Italy in 810, Charles the Younger in 811, he had been left with a single surviving legitimate heir, Louis, whom he had crowned co-emperor at Aachen in 813 without the Pope, in the ceremony designed to establish that imperial authority flowed from the emperor's will rather than from Rome's. The intention was clarity. The outcome would be anything but, and Louis inherited the empire intact. He was pious, genuinely so, more committed to the Church's moral framework than his father had ever been, and more willing to allow ecclesiastical institutions to constrain his own behavior. He undertook church reform with the seriousness of a man who believed the emperor's first obligation was to God rather than to the nobility. He issued the Ordinatio Imperii in 817, an imperial decree of 18 chapters that attempted something no Carolingian ruler had ever managed: a formal, legally binding plan for succession that would keep the empire unified after his death. Lothair, his eldest son, was named co-emperor and primary heir. His younger sons Pepin and Louis received Aquitaine and Bavaria as subordinate kingdoms. The structure was hierarchical. The intention was permanence. Now, the plan collapsed within a decade, not because it was poorly designed, but because it was designed for a family that did not yet include Charles. The son Louis would have with his second wife Judith in 823. When Louis tried to carve out a substantial territory for this youngest son in 829, he reduced what he had promised his elder sons. The elder sons, who had organized their political expectations around the 817 settlement, experienced this as a breach of the arrangement to which they had sworn. From their perspective, their father was redistributing what he had already given. From Louis's perspective, he was exercising the emperor's right to dispose of imperial territory. Both positions were coherent. Neither was reconcilable with the other. In 830, Louis the Pious's three elder sons, Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German, revolted, captured their father at Compiègne, and forced him to revert to the 817 constitutional arrangements. Louis recovered his throne. In 833 they tried again, this time with the Pope as an instrument of legitimation. Gregory IV crossed the Alps to broker what he presented as a mediation and what amounted to the public humiliation of the emperor. At a meeting near Colmar, later called the Field of Lies, Louis's army deserted him in favor of his sons. He was deposed, subjected to a public penance in which he confessed his sins and was stripped of his weapons, an act that removed his standing as a warrior king in terms his Frankish nobility understood immediately, and imprisoned in a monastery. The Emperor of Christendom, the son of Charlemagne, was in a cell. He was restored within a year, each when the coalition against him fractured and his sons turned on each other. But the damage was not reversible. Louis the Pious had demonstrated in the most public and humiliating terms possible that an emperor whose sons and nobles withdrew their loyalty ceased to function as an emperor regardless of his title. The Carolingian system had not developed the institutional mechanisms to sustain authority through a succession crisis. It had Charlemagne's mechanisms, the missi dominici, the capitularies, the episcopal networks. But those mechanisms required a competent and energetic emperor at their center to generate the instructions they carried and to enforce the consequences of non-compliance. Without that center, the system deferred to the magnates it had been designed to govern. Louis died in 840, and the civil war that followed his death was the Frankish succession problem, operating at full imperial scale. Lothair, the eldest, claimed the whole empire on the basis of his co-imperial title and the crown Louis had sent him on his deathbed. Louis the German and Charles the Bald, his younger brothers, refused. The fighting that followed was inconclusive on the battlefield, but decisive in its political logic. Two of the three brothers had to find a way to act together against the third. In February 842, on the 14th day of that month, a date that would have no particular resonance for another 1,000 years, Louis the German and Charles the Bald met at Strasbourg and swore their mutual alliance aloud, each in the language the other's soldiers could understand. Louis swore in Romance. Charles swore in Old High German. The choice of languages was not diplomatic courtesy. It was an acknowledgement of a fact that the Frankish court had been papering over for generations. The empire's western and eastern territories had grown apart in language and culture and political habit to the point where a single speech in Latin no longer sufficed to bind them. The Oaths of Strasbourg are the oldest surviving document written deliberately in a form of Romance language, the earliest words written in what would become French. They are also, on the same parchment, among the oldest texts written in Old High German. Two languages, two peoples, two political identities, recorded in a single document because Charles and Louis needed each other's soldiers to understand the oath, and therefore had to speak in the soldiers' tongues rather than in the administrative Latin that had unified the empire on paper. The empire was fracturing along lines that language had been quietly drawing for decades, and the oaths of Strasbourg made those lines visible for the first time. The Treaty of Verdun in August 843 formalized what Strasbourg had revealed. The three surviving grandsons of Charlemagne, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, divided the empire into three kingdoms. Lothair took the imperial title and a central strip of territory running from the Low Countries through Burgundy and Provence into Italy, a long corridor of land that had Aachen at its northern end and Rome at its southern, to containing the symbolic centers of Carolingian power, but lacking the geographical cohesion to function as a state. Louis took the lands east of the Rhine, a territory that would develop into what history knows as Germany. Charles took the territories to the west, what would become France. The modern map of Western Europe, with its two great nations separated by a border whose contested middle ground has driven European history for more than a millennium, was drafted in its embryonic form at Verdun in 843. The Middle Kingdom, Middle Francia, Lothair's inheritance, was the most revealing of the three in what it demonstrated about the logic of Carolingian fragmentation. It had the title, the sacred capitals, and the imperial prestige. It had no natural borders, no cultural coherence, and no political gravity of its own. When Lothair died in 855, he divided it again among his own three sons, following the Frankish custom that had undone the empire from the beginning. The northern portion became Lotharingia, the Lorraine that would be contested between France and Germany across nearly every major European conflict for the next 1,000 years. The Middle Kingdom dissolved. East and West Francia survived because they corresponded, however imperfectly, to something real in the populations that inhabited them. The Middle dissolved because it corresponded to nothing except the administrative logic of a dynasty that could no longer enforce its will. The administrative apparatus Charles had built, the Missi Dominici, the Capitularies, the Palace School, had been genuinely extraordinary as a system for projecting one man's authority across a continent. After his death, it revealed its structural weakness with the clarity of a demonstration. The Missi Dominici required a continuous flow of royal instructions to carry out. Under Louis the Pious, already managing the competing claims of his sons, those instructions became inconsistent. Under the divided empire, the Missi found themselves serving kings who were at war with each other, carrying directives from a power center that no longer agreed with itself. The system had been designed for convergence, for the integration of local governance into a single imperial will. It had no operating procedure for divergence. The counts who had governed the empire's regions as royal appointees, men whose authority derived formally from the emperor's delegation rather than from hereditary right, began, through the disruptions of the civil wars, to treat their positions as heritable property. A count whose family had governed a county for 2 generations, whose sons had grown up with the local nobility, and whose daughters had married into it, was a count whose position was becoming a dynasty regardless of what any imperial decree said about the nature of the office. The weakness of the center was the strength of the periphery. Every year that the imperial court was consumed by its own succession crisis was a year in which the local magnates consolidated what they held and extended what they could reach. The administrative structure Charles had built to hold local power accountable was slowly being captured by the local power it had been built to govern. The Church watched all of this with the institutional attention of an organization that had survived the fall of one empire already, and understood that surviving the fall of another required careful positioning. The bishops and abbots who had served as the connective tissue of Carolingian governance, who had administered episcopal territories, hosted missi, trained administrators, and provided the only reliable literate class the empire possessed, did not disappear when the empire fractured. Their networks persisted, their lands persisted, Their relationship with Rome persisted. What changed was their relationship to the secular authority that had appointed and protected them. A bishop in a territory governed by a count whose loyalty to a distant king was increasingly nominal was a bishop who was renegotiating his relationship with power on a local basis, trading ecclesiastical support for secular protection in arrangements that replicated, at smaller scale, exactly what Clovis and the Church had built 3 centuries earlier. The Viking raids that began in earnest in the 830s and intensified across the second half of the 9th century did not cause the Carolingian collapse. It was already structurally underway. But they accelerated every tendency the succession crisis had set in motion. A coastline that could not be defended centrally had to be defended locally. Local defense required local authority. Local authority that organized successfully against external threat accumulated political legitimacy that was independent of any royal grant. The counts of Flanders, the dukes of Normandy, the great lords of what was becoming France and Germany grew into their power partly through the Carolingian administrative inheritance they had absorbed, and partly through the practical necessities of a world in which the emperor's protection was unavailable, and a man's survival depended on what he could organize within the reach of his own arm. The empire that Verdun divided in 843 did not immediately become France and Germany in any form those names would later imply. The political identities those territories would eventually develop, the particular combination of language, custom, royal institution, and territorial memory that makes a people recognize themselves as a people, were still forming across the remainder of the 9th century and into the 10th. But the lines that Verdun drew corresponded, in their broad shape, to something that the languages of Strasbourg had already made visible: a Western territory where Latin had been transforming into Romance for generations, and an Eastern territory where Germanic tongues had persisted. The Carolingian Empire had been built on the premise that Frankish political authority could transcend those differences. Verdun acknowledged that it could not. Charlemagne's great palace at Aachen stood in Lothaire's Middle Kingdom, and then, when that dissolved, in the contested border territories between what was becoming France and what was becoming Germany. To the Palatine Chapel he had built, the octagonal structure with its bronze railings and its Byzantine-inspired dome, the most ambitious piece of architecture the Frankish world had produced, remained. The Carolingian throne remained inside it. The intellectual legacy of the palace school persisted in the monasteries and cathedral schools that had absorbed its scholars and continued their work. The Caroline minuscule script that Alcuin had promoted from his scriptorium at Tours became the standard written hand of the medieval West, the foundation on which every subsequent tradition of Western literacy was built, the ancestor, via the Italian humanists who rediscovered it 6 centuries later, of the typefaces in which the modern world conducts its written life. The machine had outlasted its operators, but what it would produce next depended on who picked it up. The Frankish world that emerged from Verdun was not the world Clovis had built, nor the world Charles Martel had defended, nor the world Pepin had consecrated, nor the world Charlemagne had conquered. It was something the Franks had not set out to make: a civilization, a collection of institutions, ideas, languages, boundaries, and sacred authorities that had taken on a life independent of any dynasty and would continue to develop and compete and transform for the rest of the medieval millennium. The Franks had built Europe. Then, Europe had outgrown them. 3 centuries after Clovis was baptized at Rheims, the Frankish dynasty that had produced him was gone. The Carolingian line that replaced it would produce no ruler of comparable stature after Charlemagne. Yes, and by the end of the 9th century, the men who held the Frankish crowns were figures of declining reach and diminishing authority, outpaced by the local magnates who had absorbed the administrative inheritance of the empire and converted it into the building material of feudalism. The Frankish state, as a state, was finished. What the Franks had built was not. The papacy that existed in 900 AD was not the papacy of 481. The institution that Clovis had bargained with, that Pepin had armed, that Charlemagne had crowned in its own Basilica. That institution had been transformed through 3 centuries of Frankish protection, Frankish land grants, and Frankish military intervention into something that no previous civilization had produced. A sovereign political authority with its own territory, its own administration, its own legal system, and a claim to supremacy over every secular ruler in the Christian world. The papacy had existed before the Franks. The papacy as a political institution, as a power that could crown emperors, excommunicate kings, and issue decrees that bound populations across national borders, was a Frankish construction. The Franks had needed the Church's authority to rule. The Church had needed the Franks' swords to survive. What emerged from that mutual dependency was larger than either party had bargained for. The most visible proof of this was the investiture controversy, the 50-year conflict between Pope and Emperor over the right to appoint bishops that convulsed the Holy Roman Empire in the 11th and 12th centuries, and that ended in a compromise neither side found satisfying. At its heart, then, the investiture controversy was an argument about the consequences of what Clovis had begun, who ultimately controlled the church that Frankish kings had built into the foundation of their own power. The question, does the emperor appoint the bishop, or does the bishop's authority precede and transcend the emperor's, was, at its root, the question the Frankish papal bargain had been generating since 496. It took 6 centuries for the argument to reach its full institutional expression, and it was never cleanly resolved. The tension between sacerdotium and imperium, between the sword of spiritual authority and the sword of temporal power, remained the defining constitutional problem of medieval Western civilization, because the Franks had built both swords into the same system and then made each dependent on the other. As the diocese was the second great Frankish legacy, and in some respects the most durable. The Roman diocese had been an administrative unit before it was an ecclesiastical one. The civitas, the city district through which the empire had organized its provinces. When the Western Empire collapsed, those administrative boundaries survived inside the Church, which had mapped its episcopal structure onto the Roman administrative grid. The Franks inherited this structure, used it as the backbone of their own governance, endowed it with land, staffed it with their own aristocratic families, and extended it into territories, Saxony, Bavaria, the Pannonian Plain, where Rome had never administered and the Church had never previously reached. The diocese, as an administrative unit, as a unit of territorial authority, as a unit of identity, were as a Frankish bequest to every system of local governance that descended from it, including the county structures of England and France that exist in modified form today. Sacred kingship. The idea that a king's authority is not merely political, but theological, that it derives from divine sanction rather than from military force or popular consent alone, and that the ceremony of anointing by the Church is what transforms a warlord into a legitimate ruler, was not invented by the Franks. It had precedents in the Hebrew Bible, in the Visigothic kingdom, in the Byzantine tradition. But the specific form it took in the Western Middle Ages, the king anointed by a bishop at his coronation, the crown placed on his head by an ecclesiastical rather than a secular authority. If the ruler sworn to protect the Church whose anointing had made him king, was Carolingian in its precise construction and Frankish in its origins. Every medieval king of France and England and Germany who was anointed at his coronation was repeating a ceremony whose institutional logic had been worked out in the negotiations between Clovis and Remigius, formalized in the transaction between Pepin and Zacharias, and consecrated in the spectacle at Saint-Denis in 754, when Stephen II placed oil on the heads of Pepin and his sons, and declared that this family, and no other, was the chosen instrument of God in the Frankish world. The concept of a unified Western Christendom The idea that all the Catholic peoples of Europe constitute a single community with shared obligations, shared enemies, and in a shared institutional center in Rome is also a Frankish construction. Before the Franks, Christendom was a theological aspiration. After the Franks, it was a political architecture. The church that existed across Western Europe in the 10th century was not merely a spiritual organization. It was a network of territorial authorities, each anchored in a diocese, each connected to a metropolitan archbishop, each ultimately accountable to a Roman papacy that had the institutional memory, the legal apparatus, and the political confidence to enforce that accountability. Confidence the papacy had built over 3 centuries through its alliance with the most powerful military dynasty in the Western world. When the Crusades began at the end of the 11th century, so when the Pope called the Knights of Christendom to take the cross and march east, he was operating through an institutional framework, the idea of Christian Europe as a unified political community that could be mobilized by papal authority, that was, at its foundation, Frankish. The monastery was the Frankish machine's most enduring component, and the one whose consequences extended furthest beyond the political history of the period. The monastic network that spread across the Frankish world from the 6th century onward, endowed by kings, governed by abbots, staffed by men and women who had taken vows of enclosure and committed their lives to a daily rhythm of prayer, work, and study, was the institution through which the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world survived the collapse of the urban, and a literate civilization that had produced it. The works of Virgil, Cicero, Lucan, Boethius, and dozens of other classical Latin authors exist today because Carolingian monks copied them in scriptoria at Fulda, St. Gall, Corbie, and Tours, working in the Caroline minuscule script that Alcuin had promoted from his own scriptorium, and that would become, through the Italian humanists who rediscovered it 6 centuries later, the direct ancestor of the typefaces in which the modern world conducts its written life. The monks did not know they were preserving the foundation of the Renaissance. They were keeping the Word of God properly written. The consequence was the same. The word Frank itself tells part of the story. In the Arabic of the medieval Islamic world, in the Byzantine Greek of Constantinople, in the languages of the Levant and North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, the word for a Western European Christian was not Roman or Latin or Frankish in its ethnic sense. It was Frank, Ifrange. The Franks had become, in the perception of the wider world, synonymous with the civilization they had constructed. When the Crusaders arrived in the Holy Land at the end of the 11th century, and the local populations needed a word for these armored Christians from the West, they called them Franks, regardless of whether they were Norman, Flemish, German, or from any of the dozens of peoples the Frankish political and ecclesiastical architecture had absorbed. The name of a Germanic warband from the lower Rhine had become the name of Western Christian civilization. France takes its name from the Franks directly. Francia, the kingdom of the Franks, the territory that the Merovingians had assembled and the Carolingians had organized, and that West Francia, after Verdun, slowly became. Germany emerges from East Francia, from the territories east of the Rhine that the Carolingians had governed, and that, after the imperial title revived under Otto I in 962, became the political core of the Holy Roman Empire. An institution that called itself Roman, that traced its legitimacy through the coronation of 800, and that remained one of the central structures of European politics until Napoleon dissolved it in 1806. The border between these two great nations, the most contested boundary in modern European history, the line along which France and Germany fought the wars of 1870, 1914, and 1939, runs in its general shape, along the division that the Treaty of Verdun drew in 843. The Franks left their mark on the map of Europe, and the map has not finished being redrawn along their lines. The Catholic Church, as it exists today, with its hierarchy of Pope, cardinal, archbishop, bishop, and priest, with its territorial organization into dioceses and parishes, with its claim to universal authority over the spiritual lives of its members regardless of their national allegiance, with its political independence as the sovereign state of Vatican City, is the institution the Franks built, not entirely and not alone. The Church had existed before the Franks and would have continued to exist in some form without them. But the specific political character of the papacy, the territorial independence it eventually secured, and the institutional confidence with which it engaged secular rulers across the medieval and early modern world, these are Frankish achievements. They were bought with Frankish land grants and Frankish military campaigns and the particular political intelligence of a series of Frankish rulers who understood that the Church's authority and their own were for practical purposes the same thing. The question the Franks solved, the question that had destroyed every other post-Roman Germanic kingdom, was the question of legitimacy. How does a ruler govern people who are not his warriors? How does authority persist after the strong man who embodied it is gone? How does a dynasty project power into territories its armies have not visited and among populations who share neither its language, its blood, nor its gods? The Franks answered that question by making the Church the mechanism through which political authority was validated, extended, and preserved. The bishop installed in a conquered territory did not merely perform sacraments. He made the Frankish king's claim to govern that territory theologically legitimate in a way that no army could. He trained the clerks who kept the records. He managed the land grants that funded the system. He sat in the local court. He wrote the letters. He baptized the children of the families that would inherit the land. He was, in every practical sense, the instrument of governance. The answer the Franks gave to the legitimacy problem was also, in ways they could not have fully foreseen, the answer that locked their successors into the argument about authority that has never quite ended. If the Church gives a king the right to rule, it can in principle withdraw that right. If a pope crowns an emperor, he has implicitly claimed a higher authority than the emperor. If the bishops manage the governance of a territory, they are not merely servants of the crown. They are competitors with it, rivals whose institutional loyalty ultimately runs to Rome rather than to Paris or Aachen or any other secular capital. The Franks built a machine that could not be disassembled without destroying the civilization it had produced. Every medieval ruler who was anointed by a bishop was operating inside a constitutional structure the Franks had built. Every pope who excommunicated a king, every king who appointed a bishop, and every emperor who fought for the right to invest his own clergy, they were all working through the terms of a bargain struck between a Frankish warlord and a Roman bishop in a baptistry at Reims in the last years of the 5th century. The Franks themselves vanished as a distinct people. The boundary of Verdun separated them from each other. The populations they had governed absorbed them. The Gallo-Romans of France became the French, and the Franks who had settled among them became French too. The Germans to the east kept more of the Germanic cultural inheritance, but the institutional framework, the Church, the dioceses, the sacred kingship, the idea of Christian empire, was Frankish regardless of the language spoken within it. Within a century of Verdun, no one in Western Europe identified primarily as a Frank. Within 2 centuries, the word was being used by Arabic-speaking Muslims to describe the entire civilization the Franks had built. The dynasty was gone. The civilization remained. It is worth holding the full span of it. In 481, when Clovis inherited his father's position at Tournai, the Western Roman Empire had been functionally dead for 5 years, and the territory that would become France was a patchwork of competing Germanic chieftaincies, none of which had solved the problem of governing the Gallo-Roman millions who outnumbered them by an order of magnitude. In 843, when the Treaty of Verdun divided the Carolingian Empire among Charlemagne's grandsons, the The Frankish system had produced the Catholic papacy as a political institution, the Holy Roman Empire as a political idea, the administrative diocese as the basic unit of territorial governance across the entire former Western Empire, the concept of sacred kingship that would govern European political theology for the next 600 years, the monastic network that would preserve the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world until the Renaissance could retrieve it, and the embryonic shapes of France and Germany as distinct civilizations. 362 years, one dynasty, one decision made at a Baptistrian Reims about which kind of Christianity would consecrate which kind of power. The Franks did not set out to build Western Christendom. They set out, as every Germanic warband set out, to survive and to expand, to find enough land, enough tribute, or enough loyalty from enough warriors to make their position secure from one season to the next. What they produced was a consequence of a structural insight that Clovis had, and that every capable Frankish ruler after him understood, that the Church's authority and their own were not competing systems but complementary ones, that neither could fully function without the other, and that the dynasty which fused the two most completely would rule not just a territory, but a civilization. They were right. The civilization they built outlasted them by more than a millennium, and it is not finished yet. What died at Verdun was a dynasty. What survived was an architecture, a set of institutions, ideas, boundaries, and sacred authorities that had become the operating system of an entire world. Now, the papacy still claims the right to speak for a universal Christian community. The dioceses of Western Europe still follow, in their general boundaries, the administrative map the Franks inherited from Rome and extended eastward. The nation-states of France and Germany still carry in their names and their borders and their constitutional traditions the imprint of decisions made by Frankish kings. The idea that a ruler's authority requires more than force, that it requires some form of sanction from a higher power, whether divine or popular or institutional, is one of the deepest assumptions of Western political life, and it was the Franks who gave it its first durable institutional expression. They built the cage, and the cage became the world.